Okay, good. Monty, welcome. Who else is here that I haven't mentioned? Larry, welcome. It's odd because you all look like you're in the same spot from where I am, but you're scattered all over the place. It's a remarkable technology. Okay, Reinder.
Well, it's nice to be able to talk to you all. Quite a few of you I know personally. Some only by name. Others we have met each other at those occasions where I was at the Centennial Building there up in the room, and something is happening here. I see somebody upside down.
Tai Chi.
Okay.
Oh, 1 second. Let me ask everybody to mute himself or herself, all right? And then we won't have that background noise. And then when you want to speak, just put your space bar down and then hold it down as long as you're speaking, and then you can let it go. That way we won't have as much background noise. Okay, back over to Reinder.
We are still here in the Netherlands in what they call an intelligent lockdown. It is being relaxed a little bit, but it's been quite boring. I was supposed to go to quite a few places these past months, but I've been stuck at home. And of course, Afke has also not been able to do her activities, but been stuck here. In the Netherlands, we have had quite a significant number of fatalities. The official figure stands just above 6,000. And when you compare that to the population of 17 million, that is actually quite a higher number. And not only that, but we think that the actual number is quite a bit higher, because only those who are tested are counted among the dead. And so a lot of people who have maybe died in old age homes or have just died at home without being tested are not counted in that number. So it's been quite a drama in the Netherlands, but we think that the worst is over and things have been relaxed a little bit. And so for the first time in 3 months, Afke and I, we went to have a drink at a terrace because the restaurants were open since last Tuesday. And we actually went for a pizza in a restaurant. And, that was after these months of semi-imprisonment, it was really a good thing. Well, we'll see how the coming months are going. We had hoped to go to Denmark end of this month to celebrate the 70th birthday of a friend. But the people from Denmark are welcome in the Netherlands, but strangely enough, the Dutch people are not yet welcome in Denmark. And they will not open their borders to these dangerous Dutch people until the 1st of September. So that's where we are. But it's good to be there. Thank you for inviting me, David. And the idea is that I will talk 4 times with you about death and subjects related to death. And I'm going to use a PowerPoint presentation, and we have just found out that it seems to work all right. And then I think it works in this way that you can see the PowerPoint and still can see me speaking in a corner. Is that correct? And then Dave, you're going to, I expect, to lead the discussion, correct?
We'll see how it goes, maybe. Let's see. We don't have share screen up yet.
Oh, okay, I'm going to do that.
Okay. Yeah, okay, that's beautiful. Thank you.
There? Okay. So the overall theme is, I have a future. And today, the first subtopic is, what actually is death? And then, now, let me see. Yeah. In 4 weeks, we are going to talk about these different topics. June 6th, what do
turn the speaker, the camera off.
What is that?
I'll just pause for a moment. One second here. I need to find a way to mute everybody, and I don't see it this time. So I'm going to ask everybody to mute himself or herself.
David,
that way.
David,
Yeah.
let me tell you how to do that, please.
Yeah. Yes, please.
When you go down to the bottom, if you open up the participants list,
Yes.
and then down at the bottom of the participants list is a mute all option.
Well, that's what I seem not to have. I don't know why. I don't have that.
You open the participants?
No, so that's off too, automatically.
Did you open the participants list?
I have open participants, and I have invite, mute me, and claim host. That's all I have at the bottom. There's one here.
Well, I could try to claim host, but someone's the host. Who's the host?
You know what I'll do, Monty, is I'll make you a co-host, then you can do it, okay?
All right, I'd be glad to.
Okay, 1 second.
I'll just claim, well, yeah, I have to enter a
This is the last Sabbath.
Okay, 1 second. Maybe I can make you a co-host here. Boy, I don't even have the capacity to do that.
Yeah.
I'm not.
So who started the session?
I did.
That's interesting.
I think I did.
No, that's right. Yeah, Reinder was on first.
Oh, well, so he could, if he, well, let's.
Reinder, how about you looking to see if you can go to participants and mute everybody?
Okay. I'll go to participants. And it says invite, mute me, and claim host.
That's what I have too.
So we don't have a host.
And then when you do that, David, then you can enter the host key to claim the host role.
Yeah, I don't know what that is.
I don't know either, of course.
Okay. Let's have you go, and then I'll invite you all to mute yourselves, and we'll just do the best we can.
All right. I'll try to get back to where we were. Close. And I'll share screen. You're back there again?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So today, June 6th, what do Adventists believe about death? Then next week, can we be sure that Christ is risen? And then June 20, I was going to skip because of this trip to Denmark. That is not going to happen. So maybe, David, we should discuss whether we should just continue June 20, or I don't know whether you have already arranged something else. But anyway, the third topic will be then, if we can be sure that Christ is risen, can we then be sure that we will be resurrected? And what will that be like? And that is in particular the last subject. What will everlasting life be like? So that is what we are planning to do in these coming 4 sections. Now, I would like to start by reading quite a lengthy section of 1 Corinthians, because that is such a famous chapter about the resurrection and the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And let me take away most of the pictures so that I can read the screen. But tell me this, Paul says, and I'm reading from the New Living Translation. Tell me this, since we preach that Christ rose from the dead, why are some of you saying that there will be no resurrection? For if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised either. And if Christ has not been raised, then all our preaching is useless, and your faith is useless. And we apostles would all be lying about God, for we have said that God raised Christ from the grave. But that can't be true if there is no resurrection of the dead. And if there is no resurrection of the dead, then Christ has not been raised. And if Christ has not been raised, then your faith is useless, and you are still guilty of your sins. In that case, all who have died believing in Christ are lost. And if our hope in Christ is only for this life, we are more to be pitied than anyone in the world. But in fact, Christ has been raised from the dead. He is the first of a great harvest of all who have died. So you see, just as death came into the world through a man, now the resurrection from the dead has begun through another man. Just as everyone dies because we all belong to Adam, everyone who belongs to Christ will be given new life. And I'm trying to, I wanted to get my own picture again in the corner, and I succeeded. Well, death is a universal issue. In fact, the only certainty we have is that one day our lives will end. As the writer of Ecclesiastes said, for the living know that they will die, but the dead know nothing. Or Paul in Romans, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all men, because all have sinned. The living know that they will die. Death came to all men. It's a universal issue. It's a grim reality. Every day, the number of deaths worldwide is about 150,000 people. Every day, 150,000 people on our world die. It's a sobering thought that 21,000, and that's a significant percentage, die of hunger and malnutrition every day. Well, when you Google a little bit, you find that death is indeed a grim reality. About 1,125,000 road deaths globally per year. That's over 3,000 a day. There are 400,000 murders in our world per year. So that's over 1,000 per day. And now, of course, we are in this COVID crisis, and so far in 3 months, 400,000 people have died, over 400,000 of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, some people have said, in comparison to some of these other numbers, that's actually not that many. But, you know, we do not know what would have happened if there had not been any lockdowns, if there had not been any preventive measures. We might well have been looking now at millions of fatalities. Death is a grim reality. It's everywhere. Life expectancy, that's the reality for most of us, or for all of us. Life expectancy in the USA is about 75. Now, many of you have already passed that age or are close to passing it. I have already passed that, actually. In the Netherlands, the life expectancy at birth is about 82. In some countries in the world, it's considerably less. The worst, the Central African Republic, where life expectancy is just 53. Now, death is not only a universal issue, but death is also, for all of us, a personal issue. I found it myself. When I was 10, my brother, age 8, 2 years younger than I, died quite suddenly. My father died when he was 50. I was 14. I lost a sister. She was in her early 30s. I was about 40. And I'm now 77. And, you know, you cannot help wondering how many years are ahead of me. Suppose I will live to be 90. That isn't that far away, actually. And that would only be 13 years if I count well. Many of my contemporaries are becoming weaker. And, you know, there is more funerals than weddings that we go to. And so you cannot help wondering and thinking and reading about the topic of death. And is there something beyond death? Because for all of us, it's a very existential issue. And, you know, my way of thinking about something is start writing a book about it. And so most of you, if not all of you, have received this little book. And it was just commented that it must be a good book because it's so slim. Well, actually, the letters are quite small, so maybe it's not quite that good. But anyway, this little book, I Have a Future, Christ, Resurrection, and Mine. It has been a good experience for me to think about these things and to write about it. And I hope many people will enjoy reading it and will get some benefit from it. Book has been translated into Dutch and Norwegian by now. Dutch, I did the translation myself. Norwegian, I don't know who had the idea to translate it, but there you have it. So, what do we know about life after death? In the world and through history and through the different cultures, there is almost universal belief that there must be something beyond death. And there is the idea of there is a place of bliss in the hereafter. There is also the idea of reincarnation, especially in Hinduism and Buddhism. We all know about the pictures that the Muslims have about their eternal paradise, and especially if you are a martyr, you get some extras, eternal paradise, but also eternal punishment. The ideas that the Jewish people have about life after death have been quite fluid, but generally there is also an expectation of a hereafter. Many people in the Western world, secularized world, today say that death is the end. There is nothing there. Although when push comes to shove, many people recognize that they really don't know. Christians, the majority of Christians have believed and still believe that there is a dichotomy between the soul and the body. There is an immortal something that we call the soul that survives death and that goes straight to heaven after we die. And then there is the mortal body that is waiting for the physical resurrection. Now, for instance, in African religions, there is the idea of people joining the ancestors. And, you know, when Africans become Christian and when they become Seventh-day Adventists, this is one of the most difficult things to leave behind. Often for us in the Western world, becoming a Seventh-day Adventist, then keeping the Sabbath is one of the key issues. It may be difficult because of your job, etc. But for the African, it's very difficult to leave this idea of that we are joining the ancestors at death. Now, Seventh-day Adventists and also some others, actually an increasing number of others, they believe in something that is called conditional immortality. Now, before I say something about that, let me just read this quote from the Encyclopedia Britannica about what is an immortal soul, the idea that is subscribed by so many Christians that we do have an immortal something that goes straight to heaven, that can be separated from the body. The idea of the soul as a mental entity with intellectual and moral qualities, interacting with a physical organism, but capable of continuing after its dissolution. That idea derives in Western thought from Plato and entered into Judaism during approximately the last century before the Common Era, and thence into Christianity. In Jewish and Christian thinking, it has existed in tension with the idea of the resurrection of the person, conceived as an indissoluble, that's a difficult word, and there's another difficult word, psychos-physical unity. Christian thought gradually settled into a pattern that required both of these apparently divergent ideas. But Adventists, we have said no to this idea that there is an immortal something, that there is an immortal soul. There is something that goes directly either to heaven or hell, as some believe, after death. Adventists call their view of death the doctrine, they refer to the doctrine of conditional immortality. And what does that mean? So for Adventists, death is what they call sleep. Well, sleep of some kind, a state of unconsciousness, where there is no experience of time. And so the day that one dies is also the day that one is resurrected, that one is changed into a new created person, because there is no cognizance, there is no experience of time between death and the coming of Jesus Christ. The body disintegrates, yes, it disappears, and there has at some time been a hesitance among Adventists and many other Christians to be cremated, because that sounded like, you know, becoming more difficult to be resurrected or something. But today, I think most Adventists recognize that whether you're buried or cremated, the result is the same. The body disintegrates and disappears. But somehow who we are, our identity is kept. You might say is stored in God's memory. And today, of course, we have the metaphor of the computer, that somehow our software is stored on the divine hardware. Then we believe in the premillennial second coming. We believe that before there is a period of 1,000 years, and we'll be talking about that a little further on in the series, before that millennium starts, there is the second coming. Now, that was not so common, that idea, when Adventism started, or in the Millerite days. Most people were actually post-millennialists. And the idea that you would first have a millennium, a period of about 1,000 years, that things would gradually improve on the earth, and then Christ would come. But no, especially William Miller already said, it's the other way around. You have first the second coming, and then you have the 1,000 years, then you have the millennium. So Adventists stress the premillennial second coming of Christ. The resurrection takes place when Jesus comes. Then those who are resurrected, they are a new person, and then they go with Christ to their heavenly dwellings for 1,000 years. Those who live on earth, and when Christ comes, they will be changed in the twinkling of an eye. They will suddenly become a new reality, and they will also join the resurrected believers to go to heaven. The wicked, as we call them, those who are not saved, those who are not going to heaven, they will die, and those who have died through the ages and are not resurrected, they remain dead during the 1,000 years. And then after the millennium, you have the new earth populated by those who were saved. And then you have a second resurrection, and that is finally then the end of Satan and of the wicked. But Adventists do not believe in an eternally burning hell. It is the second death. It is finito. So that is what Adventists say about death and about what happens after death. We have had this theory about death right from the very beginning of our denomination. The premillennial second coming, as I just mentioned, was part of the Millerite teachings. And of course, the Millerites were a combination, a collection of people from different denominational backgrounds. Quite a few Methodists. And one of these Methodists, George Storrs, became convinced around 1840 of this idea of conditional immortality, of this idea of also the total annihilation of the wicked, no eternally burning hell. And he published that for the first time in a little booklet, 6 sermons. Then this George Storrs joined the Millerite movement, and he came into contact with some of the key people who would later become Seventh-day Adventists. Charles Fitch was the first Millerite minister to accept this view, but very soon Joseph Bates and also Ellen and James White accepted this same view. And a couple of years later, when there were a number of so-called Sabbath conferences where the different doctrines were ironed out among the small group of Sabbath-keeping Adventists that would eventually become our church, there was a consensus about this idea of what happened in death. Now, it influenced also somebody who became known as the founder of the Jehovah's Witnesses, Charles Russell, but that was about 20 years later. There has been since then, and especially in recent decades, a growing acceptance among Protestant theologians and believers that actually this is the idea of conditional immortality is a much more biblical viewpoint than the Greek philosophy of an eternal soul that entered into much of traditional Christianity. So let me just take a little bit of water. Hope I'm not making you envious. But then, of course, you're sitting in your living room, so you can just walk to the kitchen. What is the biblical view of the nature of man. It's clear from everything that we read in the Bible that man is a unit. There is no such a difference, no such a distinction between an eternal something that can be separate from the physical body. Already in Genesis 2 verse 7, we're told that man became a living soul. He did not get a living soul, but the unity of material elements with the divine breath of life resulted in becoming a living soul, a living being. The biblical vocabulary, original words in Hebrew and Greek do not support the idea of an immortal soul independent from the body. The Hebrew uses the word nephesh and the Greek psyche. These words have a great variety of meanings, but they usually refer to the whole person, not eternal something that can be separated from the body. In fact, in Matthew 10, verse 28, it says that the psyche can even be destroyed. So, in something that is eternal, that is not capable of being destroyed. There are also some other words, ruach and pneuma. Ruach, the Hebrew word, Greek, pneuma, spirit. Whatever these words may mean in a given context, they never refer to something that can live, can be, exist separate from the body. Now, where does the person go, or what is the state of a person after death? The Old Testament is quite vague. And in general, you might say that Old Testament texts say that the dead go to their grave. They go to what is called in Hebrew the Sheol. And that is, according to the dictionary, a place of darkness to which the spirits of the dead go. Well, the Old Testament, as I say, remains fake. Death is really, in the Old Testament, mostly a state of nothingness. And I have a few texts here that illustrate that. Psalm 115, verse 17. It is not the dead who praise the Lord, those who go down to silence. So no eternal souls praising God and singing before the throne. No, the picture is, it is not the dead who praise God, but the dead are those who go down to silence. Psalm 146, verse 4, when the spirit depart, they return to the ground. On that day, their plans come to nothing. In the grave, where we're going, there is neither working, nor planning, nor knowledge, nor wisdom. There is really nothing. That is, by and large, the Old Testament picture. God who says to David, according to 2 Samuel 7:12, when your days are over and you rest with your fathers. That is the picture. When your days are over, you rest with your fathers. And for that rest, the Old Testament also often uses very often the metaphor of sleep. O Lord my God, give light to my eyes, or I will sleep in death. And in John 14:12, no, what is that? That is, we'll have to check that. Oh, that's Daniel. No.
No, that's Job.
That's Job, yes, right. Job, thank you. Job 14, verse 12. So man lies down and does not rise, till the heavens are no more. Men will not awake or be roused from their sleep. Daniel, multitudes who sleep in the dust of the earth will awake. So apparently, that is the best word that the authors can find. And the New Testament continues with that sleep metaphor. You know the story about Jesus and his friend Lazarus? When Jesus says, don't worry, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. He uses the metaphor of sleep for death. And when it is the story about the little girl, the daughter of Jairus, Jesus comes there to the house and he says, why is all this commotion and wailing? The child is not dead, but asleep. Well, I could read those other texts, why not? Stephen, when he is being stoned, when he is being killed, then it says when he has given his testimony, when he said this, he fell asleep. And also Paul uses the metaphor of sleep quite often. So there is the metaphor of sleep both in the Old and in the New Testament for what actually sleep can be compared with. Now, we all know, and especially if there are some among you who have been giving Bible studies to other Protestant Christians, then you know that there's always a couple of difficult texts that are cited as proof that the Adventist viewpoint is not right. And that actually the idea that the soul goes directly to heaven is biblical. Now, there is a clear principle when it comes to biblical exegesis that you should never try to explain difficult texts loose apart from what the whole picture of the Bible is. So explain difficult texts against the background of the overall biblical evidence. And that is what we have to do with these various texts. I have listed them here, you know, in particular, what Jesus said to the thief, to the criminal on the cross. I will tell you the truth. Today, you will be with me in paradise. So that's proof, isn't it? That at the same time, at death, the soul will go to paradise and be with Christ. Now, all of you are good Adventists and know how to deal with that text. And you know that the comma can be placed anywhere because the Greek doesn't have commas. And so I will tell you the truth. Today, while we are here, I can tell you, you will be with me in paradise. And that is just as good a translation as the other one. Now, the other one, the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, well, we all agree that that is a parable. And so you really should not base a doctrine on a parable. And it is what the lesson is of the story, and that is quite different. So these problem texts, they need to be explained against the overall clear understanding that the Bible gives of death as a state of unconsciousness that is metaphorically described as sleep. Now, and I've also given a little bit of attention to that in my little book. Many people say, and actually, yes, it is quite many people who say, but what about the near-death experiences that people tell us they had? And it's interesting to see that there are large numbers of people who claim that they have had a near-death experience. And many of these experiences, they characteristics. You know, there's a tunnel, there's a light at the end of the tunnel, and there is somebody who looks like Jesus. And then there are a number of other things that usually are part of those stories about near-death experiences. It is, however, interesting that the classical stories that we are aware of are usually from people with a Christian background, or at least coming from a Christian culture. In other cultures where they also have near-death experiences, the pictures, the things that they see do much more relate to the ideas that they have traditionally of the hereafter. So there can be quite a shift in what people see when you distinguish between the different cultures. However, and I think that is what we need to emphasize, and that is that these near-death experiences, they are near death. These people have all come back from the brink of death, but they have not actually died. They have not actually gone over the threshold of death. So they have not actually seen something beyond death. I think that's important to state. Now, what are the explanations then of these near-death experiences? Well, I'm not sure that I know the answers, but you know that many scholars have, specialists have said that maybe it's the chemistry in our brains, and in particular, Dr. Profonsha, well known with many of you, he has done some studies at Loma Linda University with people who have claimed that they had a near-death experience. And his theory was that maybe the experiences that people have at that junction can be somewhat compared to what people have, the experience that people have when they use some substances like LSD. Well, there are many questions around this, but I thought I ought to just mention also this element. Now then, what are some of the implications of this view of death that we have, this idea of conditional immortality? It means that there are no souls, bodiless souls in something called heaven. There is no immediate bliss after death. It means, and that has been a strong argument that we have had in our discussions also with Roman Catholic Christians, that if there is no one, if no one goes directly to heaven, has gone directly to heaven, except the biblical figures of Elijah and Moses and Enoch, but we know of no others. That means that Mary, the mother of Jesus, is in her grave, did not go to heaven. That all these saints that are supposedly now making intercession for believers on earth, they are not there. So this idea of intercession by people who have gone to heaven is an unbiblical notion if we depart from the doctrine of conditional immortality. It also means that all the claims of people that they have been able to talk with deceased people, occultism, spiritism, interaction with the dead, is something that is not based on fact. It's not based on a biblical understanding of death, but it's based on deceit. And of course, Adventists have always been saying that really this is what Satan wants us to believe right from the very beginning. If you will not die, as he said, not really die, as he said to Adam and Eve. And then, yes, the implication, and I actually added this last sentence this afternoon, if our view of death is correct, then your president is not correct when he says that George Floyd is looking down on what is currently happening in the US. But then I suppose he has said many other things that are not really true. Christians, people who die, they will be in some intermediate state of unconsciousness. They will sleep. Their bodies will disappear, but their identity will be stored with God, will be kept. But Christians have, through the ages, believed in the resurrection. That this is not all that we can say about death, but there is the resurrection. It's a key Christian belief. It's something that unites us with many other Christians. Christians of all the ages have said that our resurrection depends on Christ's resurrection. And we'll talk about Christ's resurrections next week. The Apostolic Creed that is recited throughout Christendom says, among other things, I believe in the communion of the saints, the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. That is what unites us as Christians, believing in the forgiveness of sins, the resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. Now, I suppose you all know the fundamental beliefs, 28 that we have by heart. And this is fundamental belief number 26, where it says, the wages of sin is death. But God, who alone is immortal, will grant eternal life to his redeemed. Until that day, death is an unconscious state for all people. When Christ, who is our life, appears, the resurrected righteous and the living righteous will be glorified and be caught up to meet their Lord. The second resurrection, the resurrection of the unrighteous, will take place 1,000 years later. So that states very succinctly what I have been saying early on. Our resurrection depends on what we think of the Easter story. And just a little bit about that, but most of that we'll leave till next week. You know, the story of Jesus could have ended with his death. But if he had not risen from the dead, if that would have been the end, then there would not have been a Christian church. And then the name of Jesus Christ most likely would be long forgotten. But we believe that the last week of Christ's ministry ended with the greatest miracle of all times, and that is his resurrection. And so, and I'm citing the Apostolic Confession, Christians have recited that throughout the ages, I believe in Jesus Christ, God's only Son, our Lord, who was received of by the Holy Spirit, born of the Virgin Mary, suffered under Pontius Pilate, was crucified, died, and was buried. He descended to the dead. On the third day, he arose again. The Easter story, we find it in all four Gospels. Early Sunday, the first day of the week, a number of women went to the tomb to care for Jesus' body. But they found that a heavy stone was rolled away. There was an angel who said, no, he is alive. You shouldn't look for the living one among the dead. And then moments later, there was an encounter with the living Lord. And in the following 6 weeks, a number of appearances. There are some problems with this, because there are some discrepancies in these stories. For instance, when we compare the number of women that are mentioned in the four Gospels. Luke says that there were 5 women, and he mentions 3 of them by name. Mark refers to 3 women, Matthew to 2, John to 1, and in the version of the story that Paul was familiar with, no women are mentioned at all. So how come? What is correct? And how can we deal with these differences? And then, for instance, another problem, the timing. John says in his gospel that it was still dark when the women reached the tomb. And Mark says the sun had already risen. So quite clearly, it was not dark. And then there is the problem that many theologians have wrestled with, that although Paul is adamant that Christ has risen from the dead, he nowhere mentions the empty tomb. So some have concluded that Christ's resurrection was not a historical fact. It never happened. It's a nice story, but it's myth, it's a legend. The story simply is internally too inconsistent when you compare the different accounts of his resurrection. But on the other hand, many and some very well-known and famous theologians have maintained the historicity of the narrative of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And that then will be the topic of next week. Did Christ rise from the dead? How certain can we be of the historicity of the resurrection? And so, David, that is where I will leave my introduction, at least for today.
Well, thank you, Reinder. Let's turn it over to a discussion here really quickly. Let me begin, though, by reminding people that it's possible to have this book. I can get it in front of you there. All right, this is the book we're talking about, and all one needs to do is to email Bronwyn at Branson Legacy Sabbath School @gmail.com, and she will send you this book, and I hope you pick it up. Then I would also recommend another book that's particularly relevant to next week's discussion on the historicity of the resurrection of Jesus. This is a book, the title of which is out of date, but it's called Jesus, God and Man by Pannenberg. I think this is the most, as far as I know, the most exhaustive study of the historicity of the resurrection. And most contemporary theologians are not of the view that it happened in the way that you and I typically think it happened. But Pannenberg is contrary on that matter. He really combed through the historical evidence as carefully as one can, and he brought this matter to the attention of the ecumenical theologians as well as the evangelicals. Pannenberg was not, he's now deceased, he was not an evangelical. He was an ecumenical theologian in Europe, and was a guest at Loma Linda University at one time. And I had quite an interesting discussion with him, and was happy to be among his friends until he died. So I recommend this book very, very highly if you're interested in a very thorough review of the historical evidence. Okay, now who has the first question or comment?
I might add to that, David, that one of the other key books is the book on the resurrection by N.T. Wright.
Okay, okay.
That's also a very thick book. It's not very difficult to read, but it's very thorough and really deals with most of the questions of the historicity of Christ, of the resurrection of Christ, and also quite extensively with a number of issues that deal with what kind of body shall we have when we are resurrected, etc., etc. So,
okay, I know N.T. Wright. I have not read that book, so that's a good reading assignment. Perhaps we should ask someone in our class to report on that book for us as a supplement to this. So any other books that we should know of when we're talking about the resurrection of Jesus that would supplement what we're otherwise reading? Okay, who has the first question or comment? And I've asked Bronwyn to keep track of it. So if you can raise your hand.
No one has their hand up yet.
So you can either use the mechanical way of putting up your hand, or you can just wave into the camera. That would be fine too.
But I'm not going to see those because I only have 4 people and that includes you and Reinder. I only have 2 others that I can see, so I won't see those waves.
Okay, but if you put it on screen view, gallery view, I think you'll see many more than that up at the right-hand corner. You know, just as you're starting to formulate your thoughts about this, I think that someday, in addition to this, we need to talk about the death of the universe. I think that the standard account of things is that we have the prospect of either freezing or frying in the very, very long time. And I wonder what it would be like when there is no one who can hear the music of Mozart. No one. When everything we think of life no longer is. I think our own personal resurrections, that's very, very important, and we will consider doing that. We will consider that carefully. But, you know, what if the whole universe is going to come together or exhaust itself in heat? Maybe the future, how can we believe in anything about the future if that, in fact, is the prospect? I once heard Fritz Guy say, you know, the questions about origins are hard, but the questions about the future are harder if we try to compare science and religion. So we need to take a look at that sometime. Who has the first question? Who has the first comment?
Well, if nobody has a question so far,
Here goes Rick. Here goes Rick. Go ahead, Rick.
Thank you, Reinder, for your comments today and for the book, which I'm enjoying reading. I wonder if we need to do a couple of things, and you may already be addressing these in your plans for our future times together in this class. But I know there are influential theologians that say you don't need a future life for this life to have meaning and significance. Mm-hmm. Every moment here can be filled with the significance of knowing that God loves us and cares for us, and it's a moment-by-moment experience. So I'm thinking of people like Rudolf Bultmann, for example. And then the other side would be, what is our view of the future life? What gives it meaning and purpose? Is it the anticipation that all of our dreams will be fulfilled and we'll be able to do everything that we can't do now? I mean, I've heard people say, I'm not musical now and I'm looking forward to the future because I hope to play the saxophone in the life to come. And so I just wonder what the focus of the future life should be. When I read the parable of the talents, it looks like the reward is twofold, and one is to continue serving. You know, you're given the opportunity to serve in a larger way and to enjoy the companionship with God. And so it may be that this idea that all of our fantasies may come true is not necessarily a theologically accurate or religiously focused understanding of what the future life involves. So just a couple of things that I hope to have your insights and reflections on as we continue to pursue this. But anyway, thank you for setting the table right now and giving us a good look at the biblical view of death and the life to come.
Well, today is more or less an introduction to the coming three. In the last presentation, I hope to really spend time on that last issue. What will that future life be like? And is it just a continuation of the best things we have today, but then at a different, more elevated level, or what will it be? And I think there are quite a few issues and difficulties that we will have to look into. As to playing the saxophone, I don't think, Rick, that is going to be an issue, because you'll be playing the harp if you play any kind of instrument there, I think. But
Thank you for that.
okay, yeah, we'll come back to that. As to the first thing, yes, indeed, many theologians, they have an attitude of, we really don't know anything about the future life, and as you say, the meaning of this life does not depend on what comes next. That is, however, not what Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, the section that I read at the beginning. Paul says that really, if there is nothing beyond, then, you know, then we are really to be pitied. First of all, I think also that we have to be careful when we think of our present life, that our present life, and I think that is for most of us here who are in this Zoom Sabbath school class, is quite pleasant. Now, there are difficulties, there are challenges, and we are faced with death, but we are probably among the 1 or 2% of most privileged people in the world. So we can find, yes, a lot of fulfillment in things that we do, and we can have a lot of enjoyment, but that is not true for a great number of a large majority of the people who have lived in the past and who are currently living in this world today. So I think that that idea would be a little bit meager for at least a major part of the population. But does not the Bible suggest that that actually it's not a matter of either or, and that lots of elements of this future life ought to be experienced in the here and now. It is the kingdom that is to come, and the kingdom is already with us. It is the laws of the kingdom that we all should already be practicing in the here and now. So this present meaning, yes, can have a lot of meaning. And to say, well, whatever happens here, and in whatever way you live here and what you do, it really doesn't matter, because, you know, one day you'll be up there. That is not the biblical picture. The biblical picture is live to the fullest while you're here. Christ gives life, and he gives it more abundantly. But at the same time, that is also connected with a total fulfillment of the promise of the kingdom in some way in what is to come. And unfortunately, lots of people cannot live the kind of life to the fullest as we can. But, well, that's in some preliminary way what I would like to say.
Okay, Bud, would you mute your that'll help us a lot. If you can mute it, Bud, that would be very good. Thank you. Now, Rick, do you want to press back on that at all?
No, thank you very much. I look forward to the concluding discussion here, because I think that has a lot to do with objections to the notion of the future life as either being unnecessary or even unattractive from a Christian perspective, which emphasizes the fact that we can be fully connected with God here. So I like very much what Reinder said, and I look forward to the connection between the present and the future that he emphasized, I think, in a very helpful way. So thank you, Reinder.
I want to press back a little bit, okay?
Before you do so, I would like to say to Rick that I will especially address the question as to whether the picture that we usually have of the hereafter is indeed attractive. And in my view, many of the things that we are told are very unattractive to me. And we'll come back to that. Yes, somebody else.
Okay, I want to nudge Paul just a little bit, okay? Paul says that if the resurrection of Jesus did not occur, we are of all people to be most pitied. Why should we take that for sure? Why not say, well, Paul, you exaggerated that. Really, living a Christian life is worth it here and now. We can be quite agnostic about the future, but we don't have to take that view that Paul takes, or I would maybe go at it this way. What is it that made Paul think that, but doesn't make me think that? What is it that Paul sees that I don't see? Because I surely wouldn't say that, but Paul does say it, and I would like to ask him, if I could, Paul, why did you say that? Now, second thing about Paul that I think is worth exploring, and that is, we typically argue that because Jesus was raised from the dead, we too will be.
Mm-hmm.
Paul is reasoning the other way. He says because there's a resurrection, because there is a resurrection of the dead, Christ was raised. So it seems like what was more certain for Paul was the resurrection of the dead, at least logically prior, and that the resurrection of Jesus Christ was derivative of the idea of the resurrection, the general resurrection. So I think that's just reverse of the way we typically think. Was there something in Paul's Jewish background that convinced him of the general resurrection that made the idea of the resurrection of Jesus plausible, whereas we tend to reason the other way? And I think your book does, Reinder. I think your book starts off with establishing the resurrection of Jesus, and then on the basis of that, we can have hope for ourselves. But I think Paul reasoned the other way. What do you think?
I don't read Paul in that way.
Okay.
So maybe I should read and reread it. But first of all, Paul was writing to the Corinthians, and it's in that context that he has this chapter on the resurrection, because there were some in that church that did not believe in the resurrection at all. And so he is telling them, look, if you don't believe in the resurrection, then of course Christ was not raised. And then if Christ was not raised, then, well, we are raised because Christ has conquered death. That is the theme that is important in the Pauline writings. We are all condemned to death. So Christ is the one who has given us the liberation from death. And so in his resurrection, that means there can be also resurrection for us, because the resurrection of Christ is really the premise on which to build. But it was in that context of people who did not really believe in the resurrection that Paul is making these statements.
Yes, and you're saying exactly what I think. Paul says, if there's no resurrection, then Jesus was not resurrected, then our lives are most pointless. So it seems to me that that's the direction. And so it's yeah, okay. I think Donna was next. Brunman, who can you see?
George Tickey is next, and then Jeff Kao.
And then Donna after that?
Yes.
No, Donna always comes first. So
George, you need to unmute. George is still muted.
Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Okay.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Thank you for such a great presentation on such a difficult topic that has presented questions through ages to people and not a final answer probably. And thank you for your book that is, as I said, not too long, and so there is hope of being a very good book. My comment and the question will be first, is about doctrine.
About?
We see there's a variety of doctrine,
Okay.
a variety of doctrines in, everywhere about all this, everything in religion. I remember when I was about 20 years old or so, my father asked me one day, and he knew the Bible very well, and I was in the School of Theology, and he asked me, I was talking about doctrine to him, and he asked me, what is doctrine? You can build up doctrines with certain verses, and you can then get anti-doctrines if you pick different verses. And I have been thinking about this since, as I grew older, the role of doctrine has decreased in my own life. So my question would be, how do you see the importance, how important it is to spend much time in building doctrines as the church or churches have been doing in general? And are doctrines actually relevant at all?
Okay, well, that's a topic in itself, isn't it? And
yeah,
I would say that yes, doctrines are important, but their role must be understood. As soon as we speak about God, and as soon as we speak about Jesus Christ and what he has done, and as soon as we start speaking about what it means for us and for our existence, as we have done today, we try to somehow wrap our minds around it and understand it and put it into words. And putting that into words leads to doctrines. But as soon as we have formulated the doctrine, we need to take a step back and say, but it's more complex than that. It cannot be, but we only have human words to speak about the unspeakable. And so an illustration is when we say that death is like sleep. Well, it's not like sleep. It's quite different from sleep. But yet we have no better word for it, it seems. And so, and doctrine must always be work in progress. Because we think about it further and then we say, well, maybe it's not quite like that. And maybe we ought to look at it yet from another way. So, yes, I believe doctrines are important. It gives us a handle on things. Just, I often compare it to the role of grammar and language. Grammar is not the same as language. But in order to express myself, I need to have at least a basic command of the English grammar. Otherwise, I would not be able to communicate with you. But, okay, it is not language. Language is much more than that. And so doctrine is not faith. Faith is much more than that. But in order to talk about my faith and to explain some of the implications of my faith, I need doctrine. Now, of course, the danger exists that we venerate, that we worship doctrine rather than the one to which the doctrines point. And that is a very real danger also for conservative Christians like Seventh-day Adventists, that our fundamental beliefs, our doctrines become so important that they become the focus rather than the one to whom they point. So, yes, I would say doctrines are important. The work of theologians to help us formulate doctrines is important, but only up to a point. It is always work in progress. It should never be set in concrete. Always human and therefore imperfect language. And there are many things, and for those of you who have read a little bit further in the book, there are many things that I think that we have to say, well, it could be like this, it could be like that, but we really don't know. And I have no problem with that, of not knowing certain things. I don't know whether that is of any help.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it.
George, do you have anything more you'd like to say about that?
No, thank you. I appreciate the input, and yeah, that's about it. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Bronwyn, who's next?
Donna?
First of all, thank you, Reinder, for the information in this introduction. For me, especially the origin of, or at least a clarification of the pre and post millennialists. There's a doctrine I think that doesn't matter to me, whether the 1,000 years come before or after, or who's alive or who's not, and so forth. It doesn't seem to have any kind of significance. But anyway, thanks for laying those out. Yeah, but I had a question, and people who know Greek, and that would probably be almost half of you here, whether the relationship to Dave's original question about Paul is distinguished from the Gospels about whether Jesus was raised first, and then that's why we could be raised, or we are raised because Jesus. It seems to me that's a little bit of a tautology. I'm not sure there's much different. The sentences are constructed differently, but whether the meaning is very different or not, it doesn't seem to me to be, but it may be because I don't understand the original language. So that's one question. Is there really a difference between those two positions? And then the other was just a comment. It seems to me that when Paul is saying we are most to be pitied, it's because we have had the audacity to borrow a phrase, to hope, and then our hope dashed, or is groundless if Christ is not raised. And that's a more pitiable position than, in a way, than people who don't have any hope to begin with and are able to be married today. So.
All right. Well, I know that, you can ask difficult questions, but, I'll forgive you.
Thanks, Reinder.
This matter of the millennium.
May I Reinder, may I interrupt you just for a second? I want to say two things to the Andreassens. Welcome. It's wonderful to have you on board, and we want to have you come back again and again. On the other hand, might you mute your screen so that we don't hear everything else that you're doing? All right. Thank you. Okay. So everybody, let's be muted and over to Reinder.
Okay. You mentioned the millennium, and we will come back to that a little further. But let me say this: that there's only one chapter really in the Bible that deals with the millennium. That's Revelation 20. And well, some people find a few other texts in the Old Testament that they say might refer to the millennium, but that is really when you have I think, an imaginative spirit. Now, it is strange that, the millennium has had a lot more attention in the United States than on this side of the pond. So much in American Protestantism has centered around the millennium, post-millennialism, premillennialism, amillennialism, and different versions of it. And so one of the American church historians once said that America has been drunk on the millennium. And when you take that chapter, Revelation 20, is highly symbolic. It's not even in a clear chronological order. So you have to really switch things around quite a bit. And then it has always appeared to me that we have hung a lot of things on a rather shaky, just this one chapter. But anyway, we'll come back to that. And in my faith experience, really, what happens with the millennium, etc., is not something that I lose much sleep over. Now, when it comes to your comment with regard to Dave's view on 1 Corinthians 15 and mine, I think you're right that really what we're both saying is they're interconnected. The resurrection of Jesus Christ and our own resurrection, and the two concepts cannot be separated. Now, the other thing about being pitied, yeah, I think that, Paul makes an important point. Think about what he went through in his experience as he was preaching the gospel. He had been converted to Christianity in a very dramatic way. He had seen the Christ. He had become convinced that Christ was a living reality. He had been resurrected. This really was a life-changing experience for him in many ways. And then he has a couple of decades that he goes traveling from one place to the other. And when he lists in 2 Corinthians all the things that he went through, that he suffered, etc., it was because he believed that Jesus Christ had died and had been raised from the dead. And you can imagine that for Paul, if all that had been a lie, then he would have asked himself, now, what did I do that for? Was it worth it? No, it would not have been worth it. But since I believe that it's true that Christ did rise and that indeed we can have a life after death, that makes it all worth it. So, yeah, I can see that that I would feel, that people would have a right to pity me if I would have preached something my whole life and then towards the end would say, well, no, it's really not true. It's really been fantasy. Yeah, that really gives reason for pity, I think.
Okay, just before Brahman shows us to the next person, I want to share how deeply wounded I am that both Reinder and Donna think a distinction I made is of no merit. So we'll just to be hurt by anybody is something, but to be hurt by those two, I mean, please have a little mercy. I think it's an important distinction.
You can talk to Bronwyn today later with it.
Okay, Bronwyn, who's next?
Jan McQuiston. She needs.
I think Jan, you're next.
Yeah, just along those.
Go ahead.
Am I heard now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. I'm not sure if it's Reinder or Reinder.
Reinder. Some people pronounce it reindeer, but I take exception to that. Especially when they,
thank you so
pronounce
much.
My last name is Bruinsma, Reindeer Bruinsma, then it really becomes bad. All right, Reinder.
That would be a problem. But thank you. I just think your topic is so relevant to what's going on today. And that the hope we have of the resurrection, I agree with Paul. If, as well as we have, of course, the upper 1/2 of 1% have it on this earth. So many people, including those who are demonstrating peacefully, they need to hear this message. This is what makes life worth living, is the hope of the resurrection. We have the hope of improving our life here with justice and mercy. But ultimately, this life is very small in comparison to eternity. And eternity is what gives meaning and purpose to our life. So I think we have a wonderful message that we need to share with the folks that are demonstrating with the entire world. And thank you for this wonderful book. I also just wanted to mention the book, Case for Christ. It's more from a layman's standpoint. The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, I think, is a helpful interesting read. His approach as a journalist and investigative journalism into, you know, how could people give up? Think of the things that Paul gave up. I mean, he was a Pharisee. I mean, he was, you know, a very accomplished person and well respected, I would imagine, in his day, and probably had life pretty good until he became a Christian. And then just years and years of persecution, having to be, you know, run out of town, thrown into jail, finally in that Roman prison. And then all of the other people that were thrown to the lions and that were suffering such persecution. If Christ had not risen, why would they be doing that? But to me, that's just such a huge evidence of the resurrection of Christ having really happened.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. And that will be my argument, actually, at least part of my argument next week, that the existence of the church is one of the strong arguments for the historicity of the resurrection. Yes, thank you.
Excuse me, Jan, what was the name of the book and who's the author?
Lee Strobel. Yeah.
Okay, so we've mentioned 3 books that can be read along with reindeers.
He used to be, he was an unbeliever. He was a reporter, and then he found Christ, became a pastor, and he worked for the mega church near Chicago.
Not Willowbrook.
With Bill Hybels.
I think, yeah. The Case for Christ is the name of that book. He wrote.
Okay.
I have it.
Okay, we got that. Brunman, who's next?
Willow Creek.
McKinley.
He works for Willow Creek, yeah.
McKinley.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me well.
Yes.
Thank you for your clear presentation about the Adventist understanding of death. I think when I've compared our understanding of the teaching of death to other understandings that are out there, I think we're close to what the Bible teaches.
Mm-hmm.
So I find Paul's construct as a compelling argument for the resurrection and the importance of the resurrection. On the other hand, I don't know that Paul's construct is the foundational teaching or the anchoring text. And you might want to forgive me for not knowing which book was written before which book, but I see from John 5, verses 28 and 29, that Christ's teaching about the resurrection is very important. And if I may just read that, it says, "Marvel not at this, for the hour is coming, in the which all that are in the graves shall hear his voice, and shall come forth, they that have done good unto the resurrection of life, and they that have done evil unto the resurrection of damnation." So what do you think, or how do you think that those texts fit within the context of Paul's understanding of the resurrection?
Okay. I think that both are, to a large extent, saying the same. And I will return to John's text next week. But, you know, we should notice that actually the words of Paul are a couple of decades earlier than the words of John.
Okay.
John most likely wrote his gospel towards the end of the century, while the letters to the Corinthians, I could be wrong a couple of years, but they would be probably in the mid-50s of the first century or around 60. So they are quite a bit early, and that, in fact, and I need to say a little bit about that probably next week, is also a little bit of a problem when you look at the texts that speak of the resurrection of Jesus Christ. And some theologians keep pointing that out and say, well, actually, Paul is the earliest voice in the New Testament, and he does not speak about an empty grave. So, you know, why is that? And why does that become such an important element in the Gospels that are written later? Except maybe Mark, that would be pretty early as well. but the letters written by Paul were, by and large, much younger than the Gospels.
Okay. Is that chronological sequence theologically significant?
To some, this element in particular of the absence of the empty grave in the writings of Paul is significant.
Okay, thank you. Ron, Brunman, if you don't have Ron Larson on the list, could you add him, please?
He's on the list. Yeah, he's next.
Who else would like to be on the list? Let's see your hands. Okay, thank you. Ron, I think it's you. You're still muted, Ron. Could you unmute yourself? Well, we saw Ron and then he disappeared. There you are. How about unmuting yourself, Ron?
You're still muted.
Ron, please unmute yourself.
You're still muted, Ron.
Need to hold down.
Okay. Praise God, from whom all blessings flow. Excellent.
I couldn't find the icon anywhere. Okay, greetings, Reinder. It's good to have you with us.
Yes.
I'm
trying to see your face somewhere. I'm going to.
I'm holding my microphone, my camera now.
Try shifting. Look at the side and see the arrow there, and try shifting the number of squares you can see.
Yes. Well, I can hear you anyway. Still don't see you, but I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay. I'm wondering about the impact of the passage of time on all this. It seems to me that by the time Paul, towards the end of Paul's life, he's already running into problems in the churches that he's founded because people are dying and people are saying, does this mean that they cannot be saved? And so he talks about the resurrection. But then if we go on a couple of centuries, the Greek idea comes strongly into the church. And it comes into the church, I think, because of correct me if I'm wrong, but I've always thought of it as because too much time has passed and they need something more than just 200 years of moldering in the grave. And so they like to think of the soul already being in heaven. Well, here we are 2,000 years, and in Adventist terms, we're getting up to 200 years, aren't we? And we've got so many generations of believers who thought that Christ was coming in their lifetime, that they would not die. That was certainly part of my family's hope, my parents' hope. I'm wondering, therefore, it seems to me that I played the organ for many years in Episcopal churches, and that meant I played for a lot of funerals and was told again and again that that person was already in heaven with God. We don't have that. And if Christ doesn't come, if it just goes on and on and on, we are forever just simply sleeping in our graves. Whereas the Episcopalians can think, the soul is in heaven. So how does the passage of time affect our thinking in this matter?
All right. Well, the fact that you mentioned that as time went by, it was an attractive idea, this Greek concept of the eternal soul, and that Greek philosophy was an attractive, let's say, ingredient for our way of thinking of the hereafter. And that actually makes a point that I think is important to notice, and that is that this always happens, that ideas that are around and philosophies that are around influence our way of thinking. And, you know, so much in our church, now I may be biased, but so much in our church is American. The American culture has greatly influenced, and American ideas have greatly influenced what Adventism is like. So, and that ties in with what we said about the construction of doctrines, that doctrines are never constructed in a vacuum. They're always in a particular historical cultural situation. And that also makes it necessary for them to change and be adapted from time to time. And also to be corrected from time to time and to say, well, look, this really isn't biblical, but has come from elsewhere. Now, the fact that time goes by, yeah, I think that is certainly a problem. And that problem is solved in the minds of most Adventists by saying, well, really, it doesn't matter how long we are in the grave, because really, we are, and then we use some of the Old Testament texts also and say, well, we can't plan, there's nothing when we are in the grave, so we're unconscious. And yes, and so that means that the moment that we die and the moment that we are raised, that's the one and the same moment. Well, that's where the metaphor of sleep also breaks down a little bit, because I can tell you that sometimes between the moment that I fall asleep in the morning, there's all kinds of dreams and there's all kinds of, you know, all kinds of. So sleep is a very, it's a poor metaphor in some ways, but it's the only one that we have available. But Adventists have thought of this and say, okay, it doesn't matter how long it is. What matters for Adventists is that, in fact, the coming of Christ is delayed, the word that we use, delayed, so long. And that was a problem that Paul was dealing with already. And he says, you know, for those of us who are still, you know, who's still alive, and he certainly wanted to be counted among those. So, well, am I really answering your questions? I don't know.
Well, Ron, let's work on that a little bit. What were you saying? Were you saying that the passage of time discredits the idea of the resurrection? Or secondly, are you saying that the passage of time almost necessitates the idea of an immortal soul? Or are you saying that the passage of time discredits all eschatological hope altogether? And there are probably others as well, other options as well.
I'm not being so explicit as any of those. I'm just simply saying how do we handle the passage of time, and if in fact we're wrong, and Christ doesn't come back, then we are of all men most miserable, according to 1 Corinthians. But the people who believe in the soul going immediately to heaven can still say, my grandmother is there, you know. So I'm wondering how we play with this reality of the passage of time for us, and how. Well,
I'm sorry. I think I understand the question now more clearly, and that is, I think Ron is asking how existentially, how personally, how individually do we, as particular persons, cope with the passage of time. We've got a lot of a lot of explorations theologically on this issue as to why time has gone on so long. But at least the Episcopalians have found a way to cope with this personal issue, whereas what coping resources do we have that might parallel what the Episcopalians have? Is that what you're asking?
Yes, that's a good part of it, Dave.
I'm trying really hard, Ron.
Sorry to be so confusing.
Okay.
Well, again,
what do you want to say, Reinder?
I don't see the fact that we might be longer in our graves as a major problem for Seventh-day Adventists, because they say one moment and the next moment it really flows into the same. Whereas the delay in the second coming, that it's connected with it, but it's a different experience. And as you said, Ron, our former generations, they believed that the end would come in their lifetime. And when I was at college, there were some who didn't want to stay the full 4 years because, that was a waste of time because Christ was coming soon. And, could you still get married and all kinds of things. Well, that of course is not, that is not a life anymore, that sense, at least not to the same extent. It is a life more in the peripheries of the church, in the margins of the church, in more extreme ways in many instances. And it is something that some leaders in the church want to keep alive by all the time mentioning that, and that's also what these last generation theologians say, that if we had just worked a little harder, or if we would now all get involved, all member involvement, and all these slogans, then, that would be the solution to this very real problem. But the real solution is, I think, that we accept that we are human beings, that we live in our own realm, and that God lives in his realm, that he has interacted with our realm in coming to this world in Jesus Christ, and he will further interact with this world by returning to this world in Jesus Christ in his good time. And I have to accept that there is nothing that I personally or collectively can do to influence that moment in time. And as I live, I have to already incorporate the norms of the coming kingdom as best as I can, and accept the grace that comes from Christ to be part of his kingdom. Well, that's almost a sermon, isn't it?
Well, that's what we'd like to have. Bronwyn, who's next?
Donna, and then George Tichy.
I'm going to pass. Thank you. Pass. Thank you.
George?
Unmute this. Okay, I guess I am muted, right?
No, we hear you. We hear you.
When people have had their turn, can you please take your hands down? There are 3 people with hands still up. Jan?
I will in yeah.
Thank you.
Right? Can I speak already?
Yes, please.
Yeah. I want to go back to the timing of Christ's return a little bit, because that has relevance only for people who are alive. It has no relevance for those who already are resting, are dead. And many years ago, I quit the idea of thinking about much about it, because it doesn't matter to me if Christ comes today, tomorrow, 100,000 years from now. It's his timing. I have no business in this. And I just shake my head when I see people calculating, and we as Adventists have a great, a big tradition in this since our beginning. But it makes no difference, actually. And then I connect the issue of the desire to see the second coming happening, the parousia, maybe to an ego. Maybe we as Christians have an ego. In Adventists, we have a big ego. It's like if we could predict when Jesus comes and we are right, oh man, we'll be so much better than the other Christians. And even if we cannot calculate it, we still have this ego. Anyways, you see, we are better than the others. Maybe it's not that strong now. Years past, it was really, really strong, at least where I was raised for 40 years in Brazil. And so just a comment on that, the connection between the desire to see the second coming myself. What is the real motivation behind it? Is it just a desire to meet the Lord? Or is it more of, well, you know, I really want to be part of that group that we did it? That's all. Thank you.
Well, I would think that quite a few people see how much misery there is in the world and feel that it would be good if it would come to an end soon. Because as we said before, we are living in a rather privileged situation, but that is not true for most of the world's population. But I think that the timing of Christ's coming is in particular an issue in our evangelistic approaches. How do you promote Adventism if you have said all along, these are the signs of the times? You can see them, they are accumulative and they are becoming more and more intense. And then each time it seems that, well, no, it didn't really happen. And so how do you proclaim Adventism? You know, when you see, for instance, our media ministries and also some of the other ministries talking about the end of time, talking about the prophecies, they're really on a different wavelength than most of us are. And many of those people who will enter the church will find that really what they have been hearing is not what many of the Seventh-day Adventists are really concerned about. That is something in their past, that is something of a tradition they take along, but it's not really the present truth, as we call it, that they are concerned about. And so that is, I think, a problem, that we talk about the coming of Jesus Christ in a particular way that makes people disappointed when it doesn't happen in the next 10 years or so. And that leads all the time also to new time setting. And you may be aware of the fact, and actually this division, the Trans-European Division, has just put out a video to warn against a new wave of time setting where people have, well, it's very ingenious, the way of reckoning. And I must say, I cannot reproduce it exactly after having heard the tape, but that Christ is supposedly to come in or around 2027.
Okay.
And they go back to certain calculations that Miller made and then work on those. And it's really very ingenious, but all the time this happens because, you know, our way of doing evangelism actually demands something pretty sensational in order to be successful.
What was the year that this is anticipated to happen? Did you say 2020?
2027.
Okay.
And if you want to find out more, then look at the website of the Trans-European Division, and you find it's a pretty long film. It's a Blessed Hope or Blessed Calculation. It is called, and it's a lecture by Lawrence Turner, who was a esteemed teacher at Newbold College, who was recently retired. It's really worthwhile listening. And there you find that this now is becoming rather important in some of the countries, at least here, that the division finds it necessary to warn against it.
Okay, Brunman?
Jan McQuiston?
Okay, and then Karen is following this very closely. And if you want to speak, Karen, you're welcome to. Don't feel pressured to do so, okay? Jan Webb? We need you to unmute yourself, Jan.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Reinder, yes, thank you so much. That is so true that we have dates set, we've made all those mistakes. I see that as one side of the ditch. I think the other side of the ditch is to say, well, let's not talk about him coming soon, you know. So to me, the middle of the road is, I think God has always wanted us to believe that he's coming soon, at least since he was here on earth. And why is that? Well, it certainly is a motivation. It's a motivation that my life could end tomorrow, and so I want to live in harmony with Christ and God's teachings to be ready for my life to end at any time. But I think also the fact that I think he wants us to be motivated to share the good news with other people, and if we think the end is coming soon, then that is certainly a motivation to get out and look at the protesters. They're certainly motivated to probably go without food while they're out there for hours on end in their peaceful protests. That's a huge motivation that they have to be out there doing that. So if I were that motivated to proclaim the soon coming of Christ, how might my life be different? And I do believe that the other side of the ditch is kind of where I find my church here in Loma Linda, to be honest with you. And I think that we can't ignore, for instance, the climate scientists who say that the earth can't keep going on forever. The way, the atmosphere and all is being destroyed by pollution and all the other things. I'm not an authority on that like my husband is, but there is a time Jesus will come. And I think the soon return of Christ is something called as Adventists to proclaim.
Well, I couldn't agree more. Yet, at the same time, I would say we need to take the word soon advisedly. And we need to speak more about the one who is coming and what that means, and who is coming into our lives and who is coming into the world, than the sensationalist things that are often connected with his coming or the process towards his coming. And there is a certain tension in the New Testament that I have never been able to resolve in my own thinking. And that is, there are texts that tell us of the suddenness of the coming. In the middle of the night, a thief will come. And the whole process that, in particular, the end time scenario that we have traditionally developed, there is, for me, some kind of tension there that I haven't solved. So maybe there is both the element of suddenness and the element, at least, of seeing things and being prepared. So no, being an Adventist means proclaiming the second coming of Christ. But try to stay away from the sensationalism and the timing aspect of it. Yeah.
Thank you. Karen, did you want to say anything? I don't want to put you on the spot, but I can see you're following the discussion very closely.
No, thank you. I could write a book.
Okay. Well, how about writing it and then we'll discuss it? That'd be great. Somebody else want to speak?
Bud Racine?
Yes, I would like to say what I believe. I guess we believe that Christ's first coming was right on schedule. And because of that, I can't help but think that his second coming is right on schedule. It's not a matter of when he's coming, why he hasn't come. We know that it's right on schedule. And he's asked us to stay the course, stay focused, do what needs to be done, not worry about it. He's right on schedule and he's coming.
Well, that is very true, but as long as we recognize that it's his schedule.
Yes.
You know, and that is where many of us, some of us at least, go wrong. And we have our schedule. And when it doesn't work, then sooner or later we'll find another one. But it is his schedule, yes.
Yes, I understand. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, I recognize that. Yeah, good.
Bronwyn, who's next?
I have no more.
Okay. Here's a comment. Elder Calvin Rock once displayed on our whiteboard, we used to call them blackboards, but on our whiteboard, a typology in which on which he charted the way different General Conference presidents have thought and acted about this matter over the course of his lifetime. And it's a very, very fascinating to see this pattern. And I think it's fair to say that according to his typology, the two most recent General Conference presidents have differed on this as much as any other two in the history of the time that he knows of. And I wonder if maybe we can invite him to share that with us, because it was I thought a very, very instructive laying out of the options, not only for General Conference leadership, but for ourselves as well. I have one last question for you, unless somebody else does. Donna does, yeah.
I have, I don't know, it's a question for Reinder, and I don't think it could, be answered in, maybe I'm wrong in one sentence, but we've veered on a little bit to the delay of Christ's coming and that relationship to whether or not there is or will be a resurrection. So if we leave the resurrection for just a moment and continue a little bit on the delay. Do you have a sense of how the delay and the continued delay and the continued suffering and injustice that we see relates to the nature of God? I mean, how long, oh Lord, are you going to sit and watch this terrible, because it is, as you have already pointed out, for 99% perhaps, or some large percentage of the world, things are not so good. And the ongoing delay, it seems to me, it says something about the nature of God. I mean,
yeah. The one who is most qualified to speak, I think, on that is amongst you,
Rick.
Or at least in the Zoom meeting, and that is Rick Rice,
yeah,
who has said some very good things in his book on suffering. And I look forward to reading his newest book on the openness of God, because that really has also large implications. And I'm sure that he has already spoken to you about that topic, or would be willing to do that. I listened last week to him when he talked to the Sabbath school in Sligo Church. That was the pre-Branson legacy church, Sabbath school in Sligo. And I enjoyed that talk immensely. But yeah, certainly that there's an immense connection there between the theodicy. You know, why do things happen? Why does it continue? And the delay of the second coming. But again, you know, we are using human words, and we are living on a different level as the eternal God.
Okay, somebody else before we conclude for today?
I was just going to add to that, George Floyd would have been very happy for the second coming at the last of his life. And if insofar as he's a symbol of all of us, because we all have in one form or another the same ultimate fate. It seems that God needs to hurry up and pay attention, I guess.
And that is a cry that you find everywhere, or at least in many places in the Bible. And we join in that cry, Lord, why does it take that long? And that was the cry there for the souls under the altar, you know, that mysterious text in the Revelation 6, that how long does it take? Yeah. And we're all joining in that cry in a very real way. Yeah.
Anyone else? Well, thank you, Reinder. And we look forward to hearing from you next week. And with regard to your question, I think that since you're not going to be able to go to Denmark, why don't we continue your series in its normal sequence without interruption? We had planned on an interruption so that you could go to Denmark. Yeah. But I think our continuity would be stronger if you did it straight through. What do you think?
We can do that.
Okay, good.
I'll change the first slide.
Okay, very good. Well, so we'll see Dr. Bruinsma next week. And those of you who want to stay by after the benediction and just chat, you're welcome to. The way Donna left it, that is, we all have the knee of sorrow on our necks, right? We all have the knee of sorrow on our necks.
And this has become very, very international, you know. In spite of all the regulations, we had between 5,000 and 10,000 people demonstrating in Amsterdam just a few days ago.
Yeah, yeah. Well, this is surely a sign of the times. Surely a sign of the times. Okay, let's conclude with prayer. Dear God, thank you. Thank you again for this group of people from so many different places and so many different points of view. And for Reinder, who's given this matter so much thought, particularly in light of his own ponderings. We pray that we will continue to be blessed by him next week.